Awesome. So today we have two guest speakers kind of leading the conversation. So we have Tim Ottinger and Perry Reid, both with Industrial Logic. And the topic for today is how to handle interruptions or how to survive interruptions, excuse me. So Tim, Perry, if you guys want to take a minute, kind of just introduce yourselves to everyone in the room and let them know a little bit about your background and what you're working on now, that'd be awesome. Tim, you can start if you like.
Alrighty. All right. I'm Tim Ottinger. I'm on Twitter as Tottinge. Sometimes in some spaces you'll see a name Agile Otter pop up for me. Um, and I've been in software for a long time and in Agile stuff for a long time. And I'm in the middle of Edinburgh, where I'll be teaching classes in the UK and the US for the next few months.
That's awesome. I'm very jealous. My name is Perry Reid. I'm also a senior consultant with Industrial Logic. Live in Edmond, Oklahoma, and but I'm currently, for the month of August, I'm in Colorado, so I'm enjoying the cooler weather here. Been a professional software developer since the early '80s. So I've been doing this a long time. Been active in the Agile community for quite a while as well. But excited to talk about today's topic. It is a force of nature that we are constantly being interrupted, and the cost of interruptions is usually quite high. But Tim and I had the experience. We've had the experience of working together on some small projects that we took on, and have been pairing together. And the paper that we published really came out of our experience trying to make it easy to be interrupted and to pick up where we left off from day to day as we worked on our project. So a lot of the thoughts and suggestions we've actually been doing for ourselves for the last year.
Year at least, right?
At
So
least.
it's almost as if our project was more of the interruption. It was maybe a few hours a week. And then sometimes we would go a week or two without us working on it, and we would have to remember what we were doing and pick up. But we're using the same techniques that we use in our daily work when we're working with a lot of other people. We just, had an opportunity to have to use it a lot more often.
Exactly. And what struck me about this is that whenever anybody talks about interruptions, it's the top of the paper. There's a couple of funny cartoons, and they're all about. The first one especially is about somebody walking in and interrupting somebody who's deep in thought, and that's normally what we think of. But we interrupt ourselves all day long. Every time you take a break, every time you go to lunch, at the end of the day, those are all sort of natural interruptions that we introduced on ourselves. And so picking up your own context from your own interruptions is just as valuable as learning how to deal with interruptions that are caused outside of yourself.
That's a great point, Perry. And I was going to ask, as we're getting into the topic of surviving interruptions, how do you and Tim define what an interruption is? And I guess on a scale of functional or productive to disruptive, how do you determine how to label or how to classify an interruption?
So Perry's might be different, but for me, it's whenever the thing that you suddenly must focus on is not the thing that you had intended on focusing on. Let me try to say that better. When the thing that you need to focus on now is not the thing that you want to focus on now. How about that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I hadn't really thought about, sort of classifying interruptions, but I guess there is a degree of interruption of some. If your phone rings and you look away for a minute and you deal with it, or a text comes in and you're only away from what you're focusing on for a few seconds or a minute, it probably is easier to recover, though there probably still is some recovery time. But the longer, the more disruptive the interruption is, probably, I would say it's, it's harder to recover from that. And the techniques that we talked about in the book become more and more helpful, or in the paper.
And I liked your internal interruptions. I think also you're in the middle of doing something and you suddenly realize that you were supposed to have answered that email or filled out that form or paid that bill, right?
Right.
Those are internal. But there's also, when somebody pings you because you forgot to, finish your timesheet, or there was a funny expense on the expense report, or it's a sales call or a potential future function that the system could have. And so, they're not all internal, but they come from every place. One might even suggest that they are inevitable.
Yeah, that I call it a force of nature. I mean, it's going to happen. Interruptions are going to happen, and the more you can do to work, as the title of the paper is called, work to be interruptible. If you can create for yourself those breadcrumbs, if you will, that let you restore the context where you are, the easier it is to recover from an interruption, no matter how long it is. So
awesome. And I just want to say, hey, welcome to everyone who's joined in the past couple of minutes. We're talking about surviving interruptions at work with Tim Ottinger and Perry Reid. If you wanted to ask a question, please raise your hand down by tapping the emoji symbol at the bottom right hand of your screen, and we'll bring you up so you can ask your question. This is a free-flowing conversation, and all input questions are welcome. So if you have an idea that you'd like to submit, if something that one of the speakers says sparks a thought, please feel free to raise your hand and share, and one of the co-hosts will bring you up to the stage to speak.
There's a companion paper on this one that you see also. There's a different blog on interruptions where it's posited by myself that the more things you have in progress at any point in time, the more you have invited interruptions in your work, right? The more things you have going on, the more reasons people have to interrupt you. And I think the first thing is, if you were going to avoid interruptions, you would have to do that by having the lowest possible work in progress. So there is a second article called Managing Interruptions that's worth thinking about.
So when you talk about having less things in progress in order to have less interruptions, is that because there are less possible people or projects for people to interrupt you about?
Jay, could you ask it again? Because I think Tim lost the connection. Are you back with us, Tim?
I am.
Awesome.
Oh yeah. So I was asking, when you say having less things in progress leads to less interruptions, is that because there are less opportunities and less people possible to interrupt you?
Yeah. So if I had 13 branches and I'm waiting for pull requests on 10 of them, and I'm waiting for some blocker on 2 of them while I'm working on the other, that's at least 13 different ways that I can perfectly well expect to be interrupted soon, right? So yeah, the fewer things I have in progress, the fewer reasons are to interrupt me. Also, if I'm in a team of 12 people, and we're not all working on the same thing, then there's 12 good reasons to interrupt anybody in the team at any point, right? And I maybe, if I'm physically present in a space where my neighbor's being interrupted, and that interrupts my flow of thought, because we all have so many things happening. And if we were working in ensembles, we would all be working on the same thing, and there'd be many fewer reasons for anyone to possibly butt in and break our train of thought.
yeah.
But Tim, that's fine for you if you want to have one thing in progress, but I've got a boss who wants me to stay busy so that I earn my paycheck. What do I do when that one thing is is waiting on somebody else.
I'm sorry, I had an interruption. Strangely enough, I just had an interruption and I lost my signal for a second. And it was
Never mind. I was just being
yeah, but no. So could you say it again? Because I actually did miss like the middle part of that.
Yeah, I was just saying, I was imagining somebody who can't imagine having one thing in progress because their work environment like values them being busy above other things.
Right. If the way of working is to have a very high whip for every person, then that's going to be a problem. You're going to be interrupted all the time. As long as that system's in place, you can expect to be interrupted constantly.
John, you bring up a good point, and I've had this conversation many times in different contexts. But you ask, ideally, I'd only ever work on one thing at a time, but ultimately, it's highly likely that that one thing could get blocked, and I'm literally sitting there with nothing to do until that thing gets unblocked. So different people are going to have different opinions about this, but a lot of times I find it useful to have my whip be one high priority piece of work, the thing I'm primarily working on, and then a lower priority item that I can switch to if and when the first item becomes unworkable for some reason. But a lot of times, when we run into this with teams that we coach or whatever, that first item is the highest priority work. And if it's blocked, a lot of times you might recommend or suggest that, use whatever idle time you do feel like you have to work towards helping it get unblocked. And that might actually be the better thing to spend your time on. But assuming you can't, which is always a possibility, having something else that you can context shift to is, I think, a reasonable thing to do. Earlier, Tim, you were saying that if you want to minimize your interruptions, minimize your work in progress, and that makes perfect sense, because if you think about it, the more balls you're juggling at a time, the more active projects you are. That's if you're pretending to be making progress on all those things, then you are intentionally interrupting yourself to switch context. And I'm sure everybody on this call knows the cost of context switching. Many you and I recently were in a workshop with a client of ours, and there was at least a dozen people on the call or in this workshop. And one of the ladies volunteered that she was at that moment simultaneously assigned to 18 projects. And bless her heart, she's doing the best she can to work on all 18. But just imagine, just trying to keep track of where 18 projects are at any given time would probably be a full-time job. It reminds me of the days back when I worked on mainframes. I used to, one of my first jobs out of college, I was working on a VM CMS mainframe. And one day I got this message that came across the screen and said, the system is thrashing. And being new to that environment, I said, what does that mean? It says, it means the system is doing not 100% of the CPU was just managing the workload. It was not actually completing anything. It was just switching context from one thing to another thing to another thing. It was actually not making progress. And so that's how I feel that one lady probably is with 18 things. She's probably not making much progress on any of them.
All RPMs and no torque, huh?
Right.
That's an excellent point, Perry, and thank you for reminding us because there's actually research behind this now, and there's actually context switching calculators available online. And based on that research, it takes an average of 25 minutes for somebody to get back into work after being interrupted. And so the more things you got going simultaneously, you can multiply that 25 minutes time frame with the number of things you got going at the same time, and that's the amount of time you can save, by not context switching.
And there's even an ugly bit about that is that if we're afraid that we might get interrupted, then we delay getting into deep thought. Right? It's like, well, if I start now, somebody's probably going to jump in the next 15 minutes. So let me wait a while and I'll do something little instead. And then if I don't get interrupted, then probably I'll have time, at 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock, then I'll concentrate. And so I put something off another hour.
So how do we?
Excellent.
Yeah. So I know earlier Tim was mentioning something about, or it might have been Perry, internal interrupters, right? So natural things like having to use the restroom or remembering to send off a certain email. What are some things that you all put in place to help you manage the amount of times that you personally interrupt yourself when you're trying to get into a flow?
I think we kind of went the opposite direction. I think what we did is we said that some interruption is inevitable. So if it's going to happen, how do we put a safety in place so that it doesn't become a catastrophe? And I think if you follow the article, some of the things, Perry, I'll let you jump in. Some of the things we talked about were, of course, saving the game. So as you're working, can you externalize your context? Right? Can you write something down? Can you draw a picture? Is there some shared diagram or even a to-do that you can type in that tells you where you were last and what you were trying to do? We find that helps a lot.
Right. And the thing I found really interesting is that as we were actually building a little product and, as we began to imagine the feature set, rather than creating a traditional backlog, a serialized backlog, we use Jeff Patton's story mapping technique. And doing that, we were able to visualize the system as a whole. So we were able to see the entire product that we were interested in building, both with the user personas that were going to interact with the system, as well as decomposing the sort of the user activity backbone into the details that we were going to create. And then just through a simple color coding technique, we could identify the ones that were planned for this next release. And then as they began to be worked, we would pick the next thing on the map and change the color to orange to indicate that it was in progress. And then when it was done, we changed it to green. And a lot of times just completing one of those stories would take us multiple days. But when we got that finished, we got it to a point where it was finished, we could go back to the story and pick up really quite easily and see where we are in delivering this release of functionality, what stories were still pertinent, and we would change the color for the one that we just completed, pick the next one that we wanted to work on. And it was just a really nice way to maintain not only the context of the items, like if you imagine on a Kanban board of them coming across, but we were able to maintain the context of the entire product. And that's really Jeff Patton's point, and suggesting a story map be the new backlog that Agile teams use, is because in the sequential backlog world, it's really hard to see the big picture. And if teams ever saw them at all, they're often lost when they translate them into a sequential backlog. So that was one of the things I found most effective for us, Tim, was every few days we could go back to the story map. And it was just something simple we did in Mural. It wasn't anything sophisticated. But that little bit of permanent context that we could go back and keep up to date kept us on track with a vision for delivering something useful.
Perry's color code, by the way, was pretty brilliant. He added, there's a color for things that we did now as a concierge feature. Those would be gray. And then when it was time to actually go and implement that in code, then it would come down and it would become a new color, in the next release. I think that was some pretty powerful stuff, because so we could look and see, what do we not have to do because it's kind of done? What are we doing? What is yet to be done? And by not doing it in a traditional tracking tool, we didn't have some list to filter and some spreadsheet somewhere. I mean, you look at the mural, pop, there it is. Clearly, here's all these yellow things. They need to be done. it was a really great way of working. I'm going to continue using that everywhere. I think I would rather use that than any conventional tracking tool.
Yeah, I love that. Steve Quo had a great blog post about discovery trees, which sound very similar. And yeah, with the color coding, I found that it was lightweight. It was not linear, like you could have, tasks of tasks in a tree, and it just made it's so easy just to see. And it gets at all that stuff. We get the bonus of getting it out of our brains into a second brain without having the weight and restricted view of something like Jira.
All right, I'm gonna make an announcement here for the audience who would like to join the speaker panel. There should be a microphone icon on the left bottom corner of your screen. If you have joined from your mobile devices, you should be able to request the mic, and we would love to hear your thoughts, your questions on the topic. I see we have one person on the speaker panel. His name is David McGill. David, thank you for joining the speaker panel. Would you like to add a comment or a question at this point? Please go ahead.
If I would, I'd also like to say hi to a few of my former coworkers. I spent some time on a project with Perry and a few others that I recognize. So glad to hear your voices again. It's been a few years. I am actually curious to know what are your thoughts on interruptions being kind of a sign of that maybe you are, deep work is, sought after. But there are times where maybe we are getting we need some slack in our thought process. Do any of you take you being interrupted for an opportunity to kind of let your mind go and think about whatever it allows you to think of and potentially let it happen upon something that you hadn't considered before?
So, you apparently know about Graham Wallace, I'm going to assume, either directly or indirectly. So you know about incubation. Is this correct?
Honestly, it comes from a little bit of I'm a developer and a QA a quality background. So there's exploratory testing. I tend to like empty my mind before I start something like that, so that I fresh palette kind of a thing, or the concept of daydreaming. A lot of like Greek philosophers and things would just basically almost be asleep. They would have some mechanism to keep them from going to sleep, but to let their minds completely to empty and let it discover something.
Okay. I'm a fan of Graham Wallace's process for having creative thoughts. So he recognized that breakthrough thoughts tend to happen at odd times. And I've asked people, they said, oh yeah, it's during my drive home, it's when I'm on my bicycle, it's on the treadmill, it's at the gym, it's in the shower, it's waking up. And Graham Wallace posited the idea that when you're going to need to have some creative thought, there's a stage where you load everything you might need to know into your head. You just accumulate information, and then you have to turn your back on it and do something dissimilar. So rather than being focused on your job, you have to focus on something else. So maybe go whittle a spoon out of a piece of wood, whatever it is. And then that lets your brain cook all that information. And then at some point, an idea will push to the foreground when your brain has done all of its pattern matching and say, here's an idea. And you get excited and you try it out and you validate whether it's a good idea or not. So if you want to look up Graham Wallace, it's Wallas.
Great, thank you. I've got that marked down. I actually have not read anything about that, those specific terms at least. But it also reminds me, Steve Jobs liked to walk and talk, having his meetings, because I think it kept enough of his ADD or whoever else's, and your body physically moving forward, it allowed you to have a little more productivity in that arena.
Also, if you're out walking around the lake, it's a lot harder to interrupt you.
That's right. You're inaccessible, right?
Which is good or bad. You know, if somebody just wanted to ask you if they can have a meeting tomorrow, it's probably good that you were walking around the lake. But if it was to let you know that your child just broke his leg, maybe you want it to be closer. So it's hard to know. You know, when you're inaccessible, it blocks out good and bad and necessary interactions as well.
So, David, it's good to hear your voice. I'm glad to see you on this. Your question made me remember a couple of things I've learned from people I deeply respect over the years. But one of them was how important it is to be present in whatever we're doing. And I know I've been guilty of this in the past, and I know you guys have probably seen people attending a meeting, right? And the meeting is focused on topic A, and there's 4 or 5 people in the room with their laptops open, and they're doing stuff that's not related to topic, right? And so this idea of whether you're investing in whatever reason you're getting together in a meeting, or whether you're focused on work and you get it interrupted, I think it's important that you embrace the interruption, which is kind of where I thought you were kind of asking. Embrace the interruption, be present for whatever that interruption is. Actually try to do your best to deal with that interruption. And then when you're done with that interaction, context shift back to what you were working on. But I always found it interesting. And I know for me personally, if I am engaged in a conversation and I'm trying to do something else, I might as well not even be in the first meeting, because I'm really worthless. I'm not listening. I'm not paying attention. I'm really not contributing like I could. And so being present was some advice I got from somebody many of you know, Ashley Johnson. And I've taken that to heart over the years.
Yeah, I have noticed Ashley. He is also somebody who would, get up from his seat and he'll tell us, "Okay, I'm gonna walk around a little bit, but I am actually listening and talking to you guys." So he has his wireless headphones in, and he would walk and talk along with it, and somehow it makes his thought process easier.
Okay.
David, I'd like to actually jump in and like second your notion from earlier about the interruption being necessary to the work, like necessary to the creative process around it. And like this is exactly what I use the Pomodoro technique throughout my day as much as I can, for that exact reason. And I find that like the interruption, not only does it have that effect that I think Tim was describing, where it puts the work you were focusing on in the back of your mind, so that the actual creative processing can happen and you can have different thoughts about it, and that happens all the time. But if I've planned the interruption, like every 25 minutes, I do often, when I'm focused, I get genuinely surprised by my Pomodoro timer. And it's an interruption, but it's an interruption that a previous version of me planned. And I find that to be much more constructive than an interruption I haven't planned.
Yeah, and it reminds me too, it's interesting. There was some, you set an alarm, right, in the morning at 6 a.m. And sometimes you wake up very groggy because of the state that your mind was in when it was interrupted. So I almost wonder, in our minds, we get used to patterns. So I almost wonder if there could be some adjustment in the Pomodoro, right? So that you're not coming out every 25 minutes, but there's some variable amount potentially that might actually make it a little bit better. I know that when I set my alarm, my watch 10 minutes fast, my brain remembers that I set my watch 10 minutes fast. So I have to actually just set it a random number and not know what it is, so I can't do the math. So
Oh wow.
yeah.
And I imagine there's maybe some eyeball tracking technology that can figure out when your attention has wandered and then
I think it would be interesting, right? My car
interrupt you.
told me that steering was required and that attention is required. I wonder if our IDEs could maybe do the same.
Hey, John, can you explain like kind of briefly what the Pomodoro technique is?
Yes, it's a technique for well, I guess planned interruption. Really, what it is it's meant to you set a timer for 25 minutes, and you set kind of an intention for what you're going to do in that 25 minutes, and then you focus on that until the timer goes off. The timer goes off, then you take a 5-minute break from that task, and then you, whether you're finished with it or not, and then you start another 25-minute timer and focus again, maybe on the same thing if you hadn't finished it, or maybe on something else if something else is the priority now.
Why is
And
it called Pomodoro?
Sorry, what?
Why is it called Pomodoro?
It's called Pomodoro. Pomodoro is Italian for tomato, and it was originally devised by somebody using one of those little tomato-shaped kitchen timers.
And he was Italian too, if I remember correctly.
So John, one of the interesting things about the Pomodoro technique is, you're right, it is a planned interruption, and by comparison, it's a relatively short amount of time for most people. I mean, 25 minutes is pretty short. But what's interesting is that if you couple that technique with some of the other things that Tim and I put into our paper about working to be interruptible, they kind of align. You know, one of the things we talked about is moving towards really micro commits in software development. So we intentionally try not to work on anything that's taking us a really long time to get to a point where we feel like we can commit. And using test-driven development is a great asset towards that. But you know, definitely within 25 minutes, you know, we would hopefully have committed multiple times. And when you get into that kind of a rhythm, you know, each time you make a commit, your brain kind of is allowed to let go of what you were just working on and re-engage with whatever the next thing is.
Yeah, you're flushing the buffer.
Exactly. And you know, that's you know, whenever I think about multitasking, I think of the paper I read a long time ago. I think it was all about I think it's called the Zargonic effect or something like that. But it was a research that was done in Russia by a psychologist, and what they found is that as long as people had unfinished work, that unfinished work took up space in their heads, and it occupied it in both a negative and a positive way. It took up space, and so that, you know, had less capacity to work on something else. But the positive side of that is, I really think it's related to the creativity thing that David was asking about. We've all had this situation where you've got a problem and you can't quite find the answer to it, and so you intentionally kind of walk away from it, and your subconscious is allowed to kind of work on that problem, and almost with no effort at all. It seems like when you come back to think about that problem again, your brain has already, you know, suggested a great solution to it. And those moments of inspiration often come because we've stepped away from the work, and our subconscious has had a chance to deal with it.
By the way, the effect. So the effect you're talking about, by the way, is called the Zeigarnik effect. And Bluma Zeigarnik was a colleague of Kurt Lewin, and Kurt Lewin is the father of social psychology. He's almost everything you've ever done, including, remember those, like the sailboat retrospective and the airplane retrospective, all of those things come from Kurt Lewin originally. So Bluma Zygarnik had noticed that effect, that when a waiter was waiting multiple tables, he could recall every single thing that every person had ordered. A professional waiter, right? A good one. But after they paid their bill, he forgot all about it. And so that began a research direction for her. And certainly it does seem that the more things you have in mind, the more context you're holding for multiple things in your head, the harder it is to concentrate on anything else. And Ashley and I have done quite a bit of time on this, that we realized that it's because we would say, I'm Zygarnik, and then we would pick something, get it done and out of the way, and then pick another thing, and it would clear enough space in our heads for us to be able to think clearly again. So the Zygarnik effect, and I put a little note in.
But John, your reference to flushing the buffer is perfect. I mean, that's really the net effect of those micro commits. I like that.
Yeah, and it's, the way when you were talking about it, you talked about you mentioned walking away from a problem when you're really struggling with it, and I find, especially with a lot of younger people that I work with, that's a skill that they have to learn the hard way, and that most often there's this whole ethic of don't interrupt a developer, because they're doing some very important deep work, and that's basically a crime to tap a developer on the shoulder. But so much of what they're deeply focused on, I've found that I could be deeply focused on very much the wrong thing to be focused on if I'm not interrupted, or if I don't interrupt myself properly.
I have a story for you. This is an Esther Derby story. And she was walking through a building with the managers, and the managers said something about the programmers. And she said, yes, they're working very hard. They're really trying to solve some tough problems. The manager said, well, how come they're playing foosball? And she went, oh, they must be working on a really hard problem.
That's great.
So the interesting thing is, though, well, Perry and I are working together. We would work together. We would usually have meetings after. We'd have a hard stop, right? And yeah, we would be surprised when the hour ended. I think that, John, you mentioned that you, even with a Pomodoro, you're surprised sometimes that 25 minutes has passed because you were so engrossed. But that also brings out the idea that whatever we're doing to capture and restore our context after an interruption, it has to be something that we're doing in the flow of the work. Because when somebody needs to interrupt us, they don't want to wait for 25 minutes for us to document what we were thinking so that we can be interrupted so we can read it back, right? It has to be a normal part of the moment by moment work that we're always externalizing our context.
Yeah, that definitely helps. And I guess I don't know if this is related, but you made me think of this. And another thing I do if somebody does interrupt me during the Pomodoro is I look at my timer, and if it's like 15 minutes left, I say, can I get back to you in 15 minutes? And so I haven't been rude to that person necessarily, but I've set that boundary and sort of protected my time in as much as my brain can recover from that little interaction. But to your point, if I have been, securing that ratchet and flushing the buffer of, I'm done with my work at, every 2 to 3 minutes anyway. It's just that much more protection against the interruption.
Right.
Well, what I love about test-driven development is that I'm taking what I've figured out about the domain, and I'm teaching it to the microtests, right? So I'm able to get that stuff out of my head into the computer.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's one of the really powerful things that test-driven development gives you. I think in the article, Tim and Perry, I think you call it save states. And I think that's fantastic. When you're doing TDD, you're working in small steps instead of large steps, and each passing test as a save state. So if you get interrupted, you're getting interrupted during a small problem instead of a big problem, right? Where you have to keep all the context in your head.
Yeah, that's one of the advantages going to TDD. Let's go another step. When you're working in ensemble, so you're in a pair or a mop or a trio or whatever quartet, and in your ensemble as you're working, you're discussing and you're talking about what's next and what your intentions are, and then one of you gets interrupted and has three backups. I mean, that's really, we talk about recovering your context quickly.
Yeah, one other thing you mentioned in there, I wanted to come back to TDD because I think this is a great technique for people to try. I learned about it called break on red, and I think you talk about it in the article as well. If I know, so a known interruption, right? If I know I'm leaving for lunch, and if I'm working in a pair, or even if it's in an ensemble and we're all breaking at the same time, to leave a failing test locally, right? We wouldn't commit it, but we'd be able to come back to that failing test and kind of get our head back into the problem that we were addressing before we broke.
Yeah, Anthony, I was just going to mention that because with our agreement, Tim and I are meeting early in the morning before our meeting daily. Our day actually starts, and when it came time for the hour to end, the best thing we could do is leave in that broken state, that failing test, because the next morning when we got back together, we had one job to do,
Right.
get that test to pass, and it was clear, absolutely clear, where we left.
Yeah, it helps get your head back into the problem space again.
We tried to do it with to-do markers, and then we realized that if we have 5 or 6 to-do markers, we might as well not have any. That somehow one to-do is perfect. 2 to-dos is tolerable. Somewhere around 3 it gets sketchy, but if you get like to 5, you might as well not have any. Or you might as well have 1,000. It's all the same. Do you find that to be true, Anthony?
I think so. I don't typically use that technique, but I think it makes sense to me because I think breaking on red gives you one thing to come back to. So kind of zeros you right in on the thing that you left off on. So I would say if you had 5 to-dos, you kind of have your pick of where do you go when you come back, or which was the next highest priority. Are they in priority order or are they not? So yeah, I think it makes sense to me.
Oh, it looks like Paige has his hand up, and I don't know how to bring him into the speakers group.
I got it. Thank you. I wanted to kind of wrap back around to something that I think John Fazzaro mentioned earlier about not only being in the mob, but also doing the Pomodoro work. We actually, when we were mobbing at a large health insurance company, we actually sort of had a role that we called the sheriff, who would sit sort of towards the back of the mob and actually sort of handle all of the interruptions as they came in with that same, we have 15 minutes left in our Pomodoro, and, I'd be happy to send that person to see you when we're done, that sort of thing, so that we could continue to move forward with our work without having everybody stop to see who needed to talk to who, as that interruption came forward.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
It's an interesting dynamic, though, because like somebody was saying earlier, the part of the point of having a mob is that you've got redundancy and that somebody can walk away. So is it a hat on a hat to protect every single person in that mob's attention that way?
I think now, so there's a difference here, right? In person, I think it worked really well, of course, because if the person was at the keyboard or was doing the navigating, or we were really deep into something, it would stop people from coming up and sort of stopping the entire flow of the mob. It's different when we're, you know, when we're outside or where we're remotely doing it. But I think it worked really well for us. And yes, if it was an important thing, that person who, you know, was being that sheriff role could say, "Hey, Bob, you know, they really need you right now. Can you take over?" But it was a way to at least slow down the distractions and the interruptions, if not cut them out for most of the Pomodoro time.
So probably maybe 15, 20 minutes is a reasonable time to defer. But also realize that a pending interruption also has the Zeigarnik effect. So knowing that on the next break, you're going to have to do something actually does contribute to the Zeigarnik effect. And that's now one more thing that you're processing.
Yeah, that checks out for sure.
One thing I wanted to tack on to something that John Reid said, he's my brother from another mother over there, John. You talked about using TDD to test or to teach the software the domain that you have begun to understand. And one of the things that Tim and I did as we were approaching our problem, when we would take something from our story map and begin to work on it, we used Mural as a whiteboard, a virtual whiteboard, so that we could have sort of interaction conversations about what's this going to look like and all that. So we began to learn ourselves what this problem domain really was. But we also used a BDD approach, a behavior-driven development approach. And as we began to write the scenarios, we might go ahead and put multiple scenarios into a feature file that weren't going to be immediately implemented. But as we understood what they were going to be, what the complete set of scenarios for that feature might be, we'd go ahead and put them in as a placeholder, as our understanding was at that time. And the nice thing about Cucumber, when it runs those scenarios, it doesn't actually execute them unless there's actual given when then steps. So having just a simple scenario title was a nice way to place future directions that we had come up with on our whiteboard conversations. And I think that helped us stay true to the direction we were trying to head. And as we would get to them, we could systematically begin to implement each of those scenarios.
Credit where credit's due. That's based on Kent Beck's TDD by example, his test list method, his technique, which I recommend that to everybody, by the way. It's a great way of, he is externalizing his context before he enters it by using the test list. And that's sort of what Perry and I were doing also.
Awesome. Just want to do a quick room check. I see we have a bunch of new listeners. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're talking about surviving interruptions and working towards being interruptable with Tim Ottinger and Perry Reid. If you have a question that you want to ask the speakers, please feel free. This is an open conversation. Just tap the emoji symbol at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, and we'll be sure to bring you up as a speaker. Feel free to add questions or thoughts or anything that kind of works for you as far as how you manage interruptions and go throughout your day. Yeah.
So we covered test lists and doing that sometimes via Gherkin or even unit tests. We've talked about TDD. We've talked about having other people and about having sketches and about having a story map. All of those ways that you can continuously work that externalizes your context as you're working. So when the interruption comes, you don't have to stop and write everything down. And I think that Perry brightly described that as embracing interruption. so that you can be present. The fact that you know that it's already been externalized and that you can recover it, that nothing's lost, you've got your get log and what have you, means that when you are interrupted, you can truly be in the new moment. And I think that's really important for people working in an agile business or any other business. That's my recap.
I had another question or thought. Someone brought up Esther earlier, and that reminds me of time that I spent there at PSL, problem solving leadership that her and Don were putting on a few years back. We realized, the group I was in realized, that we needed to have what we referred to as retros earlier. Do any of you practice having kind of a mini retro during your day, like on an interruption time, reflecting on what's been done and can we do it a little better?
Yeah, I think that's part of the natural point of reflection, I guess, point of inflection, point of reflection, is as we've finished something. And for Perry and myself, if we got something done, especially if it's 10 minutes before the end of our working time, then it's a really good moment for a retrospection of sorts. And likewise, whenever we finished all the things that we had listed down as a release, we stopped and we really thought about what should be the things going forward, what really is the important thing to do next, and how could we do things better. And I think a lot of what we wrote in the article evolved from those reflection moments or the other place is before starting something, right? So before starting the new thing, let's think about how well did we prepare ourselves to start a new thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. I know we're approaching the end. One of the things that we haven't talked about, and I think it's worth mentioning, is we've talked about doing these micro commits multiple times an hour, and that each commit is kind of a very small atomic change, and intentionally leaving the state of the system in a better improved state and still green. One of the things that we embraced was, I didn't know about this until I started working with Tim, but using this technique called conventional commits. And when you're committing that often, multiple times every hour, the changes are small. And, the commit message that you might put in there is very focused on what that small change was about. But the conventional commit adds, some little prefix messaging, and there's a link in the article to more detail about that. But the reason for doing those commits were usually either it was a fix to a bug that we had discovered, or it was feature work, or it could have been a refactoring step or something. But there were many times that we would go back and look at, particularly if we're trying to remember sort of where exactly we left off and what were the last set of changes that we made. We would bring up this tool called Get K, and it would show us all the commits that we had made. And being able to read it, it reads kind of like a little story, a little journal. And you could tell what was changed, and the conventional commit message, excuse me, would indicate why we made the change. And of course, it would have the person who was doing the committing and the date and time. So anyway, that was another great way to externalize very naturally as we were just doing our work, what we were doing, and it paid back many times in being able to go back and sort of read your commit log as a little journal of everything you've been doing. So I found that really helpful.
There was a funny little bit too, because we're pair programming, and we would start in the morning like, are we starting from your machine or my machine? I don't know. Whose machine were we on yesterday? The work had become so fluent, and we worked together so naturally that suddenly we forgot which one of us had been typing. So we would go and take a look at the last few commits in the Git log, and it's like, oh, that was on my machine yesterday. Let's work with yours to start out with, right? But it's just a funny way to remember the rotation. And I suppose that rotation was part of the rotation was part of the context, right? Like, whose turn is it?
Yeah, another thing I've learned from Tim over the years, when modern Agile became a thing, and we all started really learning what those 4 principles are all about. I learned from Tim, this idea is safety as a prerequisite. Safety is a lot of what we're talking about today, building in safety and all we do, preserving the context of the work we're doing. But something you taught me, Tim, was that there's seldom just one thing that makes you safe, right? And the analogy is in a car. If I were to ask you, if I was to ask you, do you feel safe when you drive your car? You'd probably say, yeah, I feel safe. But it's not just one thing. It's a combination of the seatbelt and the airbags and the steel reinforcement around you. It's anti-lock brakes. It's a long list of things that car designers have put into the car to make it more safe. And it's the combination of those things that really make it powerfully and recognizably more safe. So it's the same thing with protecting yourself against interruptions. Some of these things may be things you're already doing. Some of them may be new. But whatever it is you do, I encourage you to find multiple applications of these ideas to really create greater safety around your context so that you can be more interruptible.
All right. Thank you for all those comments coming from you guys. I think we're going towards a close. Um, Jay, why don't you go ahead with the closing remarks, and then we'll close the space. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So first, want to say thank you to Tim and Perry for leading this discussion today. Really insightful and a lot of great tips. Thanks for everyone that asked questions and suggested different techniques and methods that they use also to help themselves be more interruptible. Feel free to follow Industrial Logic, the Industrial Logic Twitter page. We'll be having these spaces every Friday at 3:00. So with different topics. If there's a topic that you'd like to hear or that you'd like to contribute to, please feel free to DM the Industrial Logic page or myself from Manib, and we'll add it to the list. Again, thank you all for coming and attending, and we hope you all have a great and safe weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
All right. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Manib.
Thank you all.